June, and I've already seen it. So there is a great movement afoot now of ordinary people. The moment they get the chance to have their say, and governments in Britain have been trying for decades to deny them the chance to have their say, and in the end it was Nigel Farage, to whom you've quite correctly paid tribute. It was he who for decades has been at the front line battling this. He who transformed UKIP into a useful fighting machine. He who terrified David Cameron so much before the last election that Cameron promised us a referendum in the hope of getting just enough votes to win, which he got, but then he had to hold the referendum he promised, and he couldn't win that because the British people have spoken, and they've spoken decisively enough, 52% to 48%. And as our former Prime Minister William Pitt said, and he said this just after we'd won the Napoleonic War, a previous victory against an overmighty totalitarian.
I almost mentioned Pitt when I was talking about British-style George Washington's. Go ahead.
Well, let's give the quote that he gave in his speech to the Mansion House dinner just before his death. It was the last speech he made. It was his shortest and his most eloquent. All he said was, "England has saved herself by her exertions and will, as I trust, save Europe by her example." And I think we are now seen very widely throughout Europe as being the voice of reason and sense and liberty against this increasingly cloying and increasingly aggressive totalitarian EU. And of course the left, which are totalitarian by instinct and by their belief, they welcome the idea that the likes of you and me, Alex, should be locked up for pointing out that the world is not getting warmer at anything like the rate that the left had predicted, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, effectively a communist organization, they predicted a rate of warming that simply hasn't come to pass. It's not happening. So now here we have a proposal again from the left in the EU, this time to bring forward the proposal for a so-called EU army, by which they make all the armies of the member states into one army, commanded, of course, by the unelected commissars, not answerable to any elected parliament.
So people start saying you're taking over, you're arresting people, you're not letting them have speech, you're tax exempt. Their answer is, we're going to take your army over. I mean, that's true occupation, is it not?
Well, it is indeed. And what we have got here is now a gallop towards formal dictatorship. And the question is whether there are still enough independent-minded media around to speak out. You won't hear a word of criticism of this on the BBC, for instance. And this is a big problem. The media have been captured by these people.
Let me ask you this, because you've worked in media, you've been a top newspaper editor, top advisor to Margaret Thatcher. Just briefly, and then get back to I mean, this is really a dictatorship openly announcing itself. Not since Hitler invaded, in my view, have we seen a threat this serious, not even the Soviet Union, because people knew that's an outside group. It didn't have much of a chance. But specifically, the arrogance, the boldness of the left, the radical Islamicists, these imams that call for violence, supporting the EU. I mean, it's really just a crew of motley trash.
Well, what has happened is that the governing class worldwide, the classe politique, as the French call it, they have been making common totalitarian cause. You've got the two kinds of totalitarianism, the corporatists who like to be involved with big business and get big business to go along with them. Those are the fascists. Then you've got the communists, the open collectivists, and that they're now finding common cause for the first time. They battled each other in the 20th century, but now they are standing together against liberty. And that's the significance of this European army move. It's that they're so desperate. They know that the peoples of Europe do not love them. They know that they have failed to deliver what we would regard as useful European government. So they are now panicking and saying, how can we cling by the fingernails to this empire of bureaucracy that we have created, even though it's hated by the peoples of Europe? And the answer, of course, is to get the governing elites of Europe to join together, just as they did in trying to bully us into voting for staying in the European Union, and that failed. So now they're going to do it by force. Just as in the United States, as you rightly point out, there's a growing movement, and it's now almost official part of the Democratic platform, that anybody who actually comes out and says, hang on a moment, there are serious scientific problems with this climate change nonsense, can be arrested and detained and put on trial for that. But here's the difficulty. For as long as they're still talking about putting people on trial, there is at least the chance that you might get a fair trial, because the great thing about a trial is that both sides are heard. The danger with the European Army proposal is that there is no court to whom anyone in Europe can appeal if their governing class decides to go down this route, because then that common European army will be established. And let us be quite clear, its aim is not to do what NATO does, to protect the member states of NATO, so that if any one of those states is invaded,
its aim is to keep countries within the system. They admit.
And come to its aid. This is an internal army designed to suppress the will of the people and keep them cowering in fear, and to kick down the door, just like the KGB, if the people disagree with them. That is what the European army is about. That's why they want a European army as well as NATO, because NATO already deals with the external defense of Europe. It's NATO that's kept the peace and kept the Russians and everybody else at bay. So why do they need a European army as well as NATO? Answer, because NATO is explicitly forbidden to police the internal affairs of member states.
And member states contribute to NATO. It's not commanded by NATO itself, so it goes back to the more republic strategy, but in a military coalition, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, Lord Monckton, we're going to skip this network break so we have more time. I wanted to get Kit Daniels briefly, one of our writers that's been writing about this. And we have another writer, Clifford Cunningham, who wrote about this last week, proposed EU army hidden from British voters until after Brexit. And then right after, they bring it out, just showing the amazing stealth of this. Kit Daniels?
Yes, Alex. Yesterday, it was on Thursday, I believe, I posted this article from our new guy, Clifford Cunningham. And now this is before Brexit even happened. He said that as citizens of the United Kingdom prepare to cast their votes in a nationwide referendum to decide whether or not to leave the European Union, a plan detailing the initial framework of the creation of the EU army is being kept hidden from the public until the day after the vote. So now the EU bureaucrats are claiming that this whole EU army program is a response to Brexit, but this proves that it was not at all. They had this plan for months.
But that exactly, but I mean, isn't it even more outrageous, Lord Monckton, than going back to Kit briefly, Daniels, that their answer is, we're not going to let you leave. I mean, I'm reading the draft of it, and it says, we're going to keep you in. We're one shared common group. Basically, we're going to make it harder for you to leave. They're admitting that, hey, you didn't get to vote to enter this. We're unelected, and we're going to let you leave.
Now, this European army idea has in fact been kicking around for a long time, and it's been gathering dust, but also gathering momentum among the totalitarian left, because since the fall of fascism and communism, the left have not had armies like that of Hitler and of Stalin at their disposal. And so they realize now they cannot out-argue us. They cannot speak against democracy and expect to be heard by democracy. They tried that. And even with all the elite backing only one side of the vote, it's the other side, the democratic side, that carried the day in Britain. So now, although I was born in a democracy, I do not live in one, I shall die in one. So the British people have won that. But the response, it's not a response to Brexit, this European army plan. It's been around for actually at least 15 years.
It's amazing.
And gathering momentum all that time. And as I say, the significance of this European army and the fact that only now are they admitting the latest stage in its development, as they knew perfectly well that there will be an even larger negative vote against the EU if this had come out in public. This just shows how little they care for how ordinary people think.
Lord Monckton, I want to go back to you in a moment. I want to go back to you in a moment, but I want to have Kit be able to chime back in one more time because he's been on this beat writing about it. But then I want to ask you, Monckton, so ruminate on this for about a minute. You've told us which shoe is going to drop next, years before it happened. Please tell us what you expect from the EU next, what their scams are going to be, how we counter this, and do you agree with me that regardless, it's one of the biggest victories in modern history against totalitarianism because we force the fact that, yes, we don't get to vote, you're unelected, world government's now out in the open, we've got world leaders like Donald Trump and Nigel Farage talking about mega banks. I mean, it seems to me this is just absolutely devastating events that in the end will sink these people. But just like Hitler didn't know he was beaten at Leningrad or at the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, they're still going to fight on for a while. So I want to get your take, Lord Monckton, in just a moment. Finishing up, Kit, other points.
Yeah, I'm working on an article right now, Alex. I saw CNN yesterday, and they brought in a former ambassador, Christopher Hill, who said, quote, "The only way to make Europe more than the sum of member state diplomacies is to make it into a real state. Multi-level governance may be just about satisfactory for managing mountains of butter, but is barely suitable for making decisions about guns." And CNN brought this guy on as a quote, interview, but it's a little more than a propaganda piece.
Let me respond to that and then get Lord Monckton's response then to my 3 questions if you can remember them. Look, again, you look at the EU, it's always been there to destroy the nation states, get them into debt, and then fold them into the superstate. They wrote about that 50 years ago. So their conspiracy is public to those that are learned. It's not debatable. The problem is the general public now begins to understand that this is a wicked organization. But how do we take them to the next level to understand it's always been premeditated? Lord Monckton.
The first thing to do is to understand that this has now become, it didn't start as a premeditated attempt to take away democracy, but it has rapidly become exactly that as the people who are behind all this realized how feeble the response of nation states would be when they needed to defend themselves. And already what is happening as a result of this vote is that there are about 3.5 to 4 million signatures on a petition demanding there should be a rerun of the referendum in Britain because they don't like the result. And it'll be just like Denmark and Ireland, where they were made to vote again and vote again until they got the result that the governing class wanted. And only then was that referendum regarded as final. The same thing is now being attempted even with the British people. And I can tell you we're not going to like that very much. We are going to oppose this very vigorously. The more the governing establishment tries to discredit and dishonor and not to implement that referendum, the more strongly the support for freedom will grow among ordinary people. And eventually the Conservative Party, which is deeply divided on this and half of which still wishes that it could overturn this referendum and simply carry on as though it hadn't happened. You've got the whole of the Labour Party, which is effectively communist under its present leader, Jeremy Corbyn, now in disarray. But the disarray is mainly due to an argument about how far they should push a reversal of the people's will.
Okay, but am I right, though, that
the parliamentary bill that will be necessary to break us free of Europe? The referendum on its own doesn't do it. Parliament then has to do the people's will. And with the likes of the Labour Party and the Scottish National Workers' Party, all these parties that are left-wing, the so-called liberal, so-called Democrats, who are neither, the so-called Greens, who are the destroyers of the planet. These people, they're all on the far left. From
I understand, but long term,
they are going to fight and fight and fight to make sure that they will use the majority that they can muster in Parliament, together with a whole lot of conservatives who aren't really conservative at all, to vote down any bill to give effect.
So that's their next scam. Let me ask you this then.
Union. That's going to be the next battle.
Sure. I mean, just brief questions here fast, because I want your view on this. But do you agree with me, though, that the genie's out of the bottle? It's going to be a long fight, but there's no way, I mean, unless it's a total dictatorship, that they're ever going to be able to keep this thing in place. How long until you think Europe finally falls apart?
The people have spoken here in Britain. They haven't been allowed to speak almost everywhere else. Where they have been allowed to speak, they have tended to be told to go and vote again until they get the answer the elites want. That technique will no longer work. There is now a need for something I've mentioned before, which is an international grouping to advance the cause of liberty. No longer, if we stand alone as national parties, will we be strong enough to defeat
That's my next question about Trump.
Totalitarian monster.
You've talked about an open society of governments and peoples working together in shared cause so that the globalists just don't act like they're the only ones trying to have humanity come together. Why have we given them that power? We need something to counter that.
We do. We now need a Freedom International. I don't know what we'll call it, but something like that, which is a subscription membership party, which everybody joins from America, from Britain, from all the other countries of Europe and the Commonwealth and everywhere else where liberty still matters. Because if we don't stand together now, then we'll fall. As I think it was Benjamin Franklin used to say.
We'll hang separate.
We must all hang together, or assuredly we